Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show. Today, bringing you another really cool individual involved in technologies that are creating a better tomorrow for all of us. Today, we have the honor of being joined by Dr. Ariel Dowling. She is Senior Director and Head of the Sensing and Measurement Group. That's within the Data Sciences Institute at Takeda Pharmaceuticals. And in her current role, she oversees assessment, validation, and deployment of various digital devices, as well as screening endpoints across the organization. Dr. Dowling was previously a senior clinical data scientist at Biogen. There, she managed the wearable sensors that were deployed in various clinical trials in that organization for Parkinson's disease. Prior to that, she was also the algorithm team lead at MC10, which was a company developing these thin conformal electronic systems that would flex and stretch and bend with the natural world. She also worked at BioSensics, a company that was developing wearable sensors and digital platforms for clinical trials and various aspects of patient monitoring and health assessment. Dr. Dowling holds a master's and a PhD in mechanical engineering from Stanford. Did her undergraduate work in mechanical engineering at Dartmouth, as well did postdoc work in robotics at Technion over in Israel. She also currently serves as a strategic advisory board member of the Digital Medicine Society. A lot of really cool topics and themes to get into today. Honor to have her, Dr. Ariel Dowling. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thanks. It's great to speak with you.
Hey, great having you. We've been talking for a little bit. Glad we finally had the opportunity to set up a show. Love to start off, as we typically do on this show, by handing our guests the floor for a little bit, just to talk a little bit more about yourself and your background. We'd love to hear sort of the early story about everything started off, where you grew up, how you got interested in STEM, and a little bit of why mechanical engineering in general. I think that'd be a great way to get things going.
Yeah. Well, if you ask my mother, she'll say that she knew I was going to be an engineer from the age I was 5 or 6 because of the way I would put my Legos together. So, a lot of kids would take, a whole bunch of Legos, throw them together, break them apart, build all kinds of crazy things. I would meticulously build every single set exactly to the instructions, and make sure that everything looked exactly how it was and was perfectly aligned and everything was arranged, and then, meticulously move on to the next one and then deconstruct it and put it back together again. So she said that she always knew I was going to be an engineer from the way that I put my Legos together as a child. For me, I guess, it always kind of the mechanical world always resonated with me. I was interested in math and physics when I was in high school, and I was, I distinctly remember a lab in high school where it was a propulsion lab, where if you managed to calculate properly how you could catapult a ball from one place to the other and you landed it in the bowl, you didn't have to write the lab report. So nice. there was a big win to try and get that ball in there. And I remember spending hours calculating exactly the trajectory, and you only got one shot at it. And just to make sure I didn't do the lab report. In retrospect, I realized that all the effort I put into it was more than the lab report would have been, but that was sort of the teacher's way of figuring that out. We did get it in. We got it. My first try, we got it in. I think the real difference for me was when I went to college. I was lucky to go to Dartmouth, which has a smaller engineering school. But one of the best things about Dartmouth's engineering program is that it's very interdisciplinary, and they really focus on bringing a lot of people together and giving them the option of trying out engineering. And so at that time, I was kind of deciding, did I want to be a medical doctor? I was interested in biology too. Did I want to go into computer science? I had just taken a coding course and I was very interested in computer science, which in 2001 was really starting to get much bigger. And then they also offered an intro to engineering course. And so one of the things I loved about that course that I took, and I took it as a freshman, so I had very little background in engineering, very little background really in much of all. But this is one of my first college courses that I took. And this intro to engineering course really showed me that I could tie in every single one of my interests within engineering. I could do that biology aspect in engineering. I could do computer science in engineering. I could do all of these things and still build and create and be creative within engineering. So I think that the focus that Dartmouth had on bringing in kids who really hadn't had much experience in any of this and saying, hey, try it, just do something, start to think like an engineer, start to ideate, start to, be inventive, that kind of thing, really showed me early on that this could be a career for me. As well as being a place where they were very, obviously I'm a woman in engineering, which is not as common, but it was very much a place where they tried to make it open to everyone. You didn't have to have been coding for 6 years on a computer to access the course. You didn't have to have that type of experience. And so for me, it really resonated, and I was able to kind of take that and say, all right, this is where I want to go. And so I'm really glad that I had that opportunity, because it definitely shaped my life. And we also had very small class sizes, which is nice for an engineering school. Again, small engineering school. So a lot of our upper level classes were 12, 13, 14 students. And that really helped to really make the class focused, and we all worked together on things. We all did a lot of group projects together, and it really I really love the collaborative aspect of engineering. And as I've gotten older, that is how life is. You don't work in at Takeda. I don't work on a single project by myself and never talk to everyone. Everything is always collaborative. Everything is always within groups. You're always dealing with people. And so I think that training, that you work on projects all together in a team, is critical to becoming a successful engineer and to becoming a successful later in life. So that was kind of my my intro into engineering. My intro into, I would say, wearable devices and wearable technology came as a result of trying to find a solution to a looming problem. So I was an athlete. I've been an athlete my whole life. I played soccer for many years, and then I switched over to ultimate frisbee when I went to college. I was on the ultimate frisbee team in college. We went to nationals. It was very exciting. One of the things that I always noticed about frisbee and about soccer and about playing on all these team sports was all the number of knee injuries that would happen. And that was something that especially I would see my female teammates happening, especially the anterior cruciate ligament, or the ACL injury. So women are 4 to 6 times greater at risk of having an ACL injury than men, and no one still really knows why. There's still not there's a lot of theories, there's a lot of hypotheses as to why that might be the case, but regardless, women are much more at risk for this knee injury, and it's a fairly devastating injury. It's going to put you out for sports. It's about a 9-month recovery. Yep. You never really gain back those kinematics that you've lost with the surgery. And if you've had one, you're much more at risk of having more. So it's a pretty devastating knee injury. And throughout my sports career, I saw different teammates land wrong, bend wrong, something happen, have ACL injuries. I thankfully, knock on wood, have never had one. But when I was in college, I started saying, you know what, maybe there's a way that I could stop this from happening. Like, is there a way I could possibly prevent ACL injuries, not just for myself, because I really would like to not have a knee injury, but also, for the general, all my teammates, like all these different people. What can I do to try and prevent these types of knee injuries from happening? And so in graduate school, I went to Stanford for graduate school, and I started in a lab that focused on ACL injuries. So the lab was focused at that time mostly on rehabilitation after ACL injury occurs, and on improving the actual surgery for the injury, right? So looking at other better ways to do this. It's a very complex surgery, to an ACL injury surgery, and are there better techniques, are there better surgery techniques, are there better ways to do it to try and recover those kinematics? So for me, though, I came in and I said, what if we just try to stop this whole thing before it starts. Like, what if is there a way for us to say, hey, you guys are more at risk for an injury. You should probably go into some kind of like physical therapy or extra training or do something to try and prevent this injury from occurring before it happens.
Mhm.
So that's what I was interested in, is trying to say, okay, can we identify the people that are at risk for this knee injury before they have the knee injury, and then potentially get them extra support, extra training, better, targeted physical therapy, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
And at the time, the answer was, yeah, you can, but you have to know what their movements are, because
Right.
there are known ways that people move during sports that put them more at risk for injury. So the basic answer is, if you're jumping and you land very stiff, you land with your knees more upright, more straight, you land in that knock-kneed position, all those things put you at greater risk for an ACL injury, because that puts you in a mechanical force position that puts a lot of stress on your knees. And so if you land like that, especially on a single leg, you're putting a ton of force right through those ligaments, and you're much more likely to tear them. Whereas if you land in sort of a cat-like position, if you land with your knees bent, if you land softly, if you land with your knees straight, everything they always tell you, like bend your knees, bend your back, land in that crouch position, you're
Mhm.
much less likely to have a risk for injury, because you're not putting that force through those ligaments, you're putting the force through your muscles, and your muscles are made to handle it. I like to give the example of LeBron James. If you ever look at LeBron James, when he lands, that man lands like a cat. He's got
Mhm.
perfect biomechanics. It's one of the reasons why he's such a great athlete, why he's rarely injured for the sport that he's in, because he has amazing biomechanics, and he just lands in such a way that puts him far less at risk for injury. Well, the question is now, okay, fine, you can measure these people as they're jump landing and they're doing all these things, but how do you do that? How do you identify the people? How do you measure those kinematics quickly? Because you can't bring everyone through a whole motion capture lab and put them on, with all the motion capture apparatus and do all that things. So this is back in, 2005, 2006, 2007, back then. So what I started looking into is wearable technology, because I said,
Yep.
okay, well, we have these new sensors, we have these motion sensors, we have these accelerometers and gyroscopes, they can measure motion. Maybe we can use these to measure human motion and determine how people are landing improperly, how they're, which ones are more at risk for injury. And then once we see how they're landing, can we possibly change their movements? Can we tell them, hey, you landed really upright, can you try and flex more when you land? Can you try and train a little bit more? Can we increase that landing motion? Can we tell you to push your knees out when you land to try and get rid of that knock-knee position? Um, I also had a little bit of luck in that the iPhone came out in 2007,
Yep.
which is important, because the sensors I was using, those accelerometers and gyroscopes, are in every single smartphone that there is. Before the iPhone came out, those sensors were very expensive. They were hard to get because there was very little need for them. The margin for buying those sensors was small. Most of the people using them were using them for model airplanes to try and use to balance a model airplane as it flew. But I needed them for human motion, and then the iPhone needed them for figuring out, how you're moving your phone, how that phone rotation is moving around. So suddenly, a sensor that used to cost $1,000 a sensor, after the iPhone came out, went down to less than $1 a sensor, because of the
Yep.
economies of scale. Because suddenly, millions and millions and millions of these sensors were being manufactured, many more people were doing them. It became so much more popular. So the ability to measure human movement using these types of sensors just skyrocketed after the iPhone came out, and that was a huge technology increase. And so
Mhm.
then, my focus for my PhD work was saying, okay, well, how can I use these sensors and these technology and build an algorithm that will measure jump landing movement, that will measure people's movement during a quick assessment in the clinic without use of all the fancy motion capture apparatus, and identify who might be more at risk of injury after this particular movement.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of how I got into wearable sensors. It came from a problem that I really wanted to solve, which was, how can I prevent knee injuries from occurring, especially in women athletes? And the solution ended up being, yeah, you can use wearable technology. You can use wearable sensors. You can focus on this wearable tech and actually identify people that are more at risk for injury before the injury happens, and then hopefully identify ways and strategies that they can practice, they can train on, et cetera, to reduce their risk for injury.
Mhm. And again, for everybody watching and listening, you can find Dr. Dowling's dissertation, Understanding and Preventing Anterior Cruciate Ligament Injuries Using Novel Motion Analysis Systems. And again, it's a extremely comprehensive, and you really do go into sort of every single aspect of jumping to landing. And then I know a piece of that too that don't nobody think about, as you were mentioning, this is a terrible injury for athletes, but then it can go further downhill than that in terms of osteoarthritis and all sorts of
Yeah.
degenerative joint diseases. So it's really an extremely comprehensive set of work, and extremely impressive. And I encourage everybody listening and this be watching the show to check this out, because you can take a look at it online from 2011.
I will
Um,
say that in the last 15 years, there have been a lot of advancements too, though. So, definitely check out the newest research as well
yeah,
to say,
yeah.
my dissertation is lovely, but it's a snapshot in time. And so there has been a lot in this field because continues to be a problem for,
Yeah,
for all athletes everywhere.
absolutely. But yeah, I mean, again, it shows, some 15 years ago, you're thinking about this stuff. So it's no, it's again a very impressive set of work. It's interesting because you after this, and then your postdoc work, and we'll talk a little bit more postdoc later on in the show when we get to robotics and other things of that nature. But you get a little bit into your career, following your dissertation, and you're really transitioning from, okay, here's, as you mentioned, LeBron James and the extremely active ultimate frisbee and lacrosse players like yourself. You start getting into things that are much more degenerative, in terms of things like Huntington's disease, stroke rehabilitation, aspects of what happens with wheelchair users. And again, very comprehensive set of publications can be found in PubMed on Dr. Dowling's work. Talk a little bit about this, because clearly you're getting into much more clinically advanced conditions here, and again merging these themes of wearables, of sensors, stuff that has not normally been associated with the industry to date. You're bringing them in as sort of pieces of and we'll get into talk at the top of the ecosystem surrounding these patients. Talk a little bit about this era and some of the things you took away from working with these types of patients.
Yeah, and I think that really goes for there's a couple different ways you can kind of go with this work in sort of the med tech space. You could go to sort of optimizing athletics, improving function, improving fitness, or you can go with trying to prevent more degeneration,
Right.
like trying to look on the health side to say, hey, let's try and see if we can use motion to really understand health conditions, etc. And so that's kind of the route that I went down. I was really interested in med tech. I had been interested in medicine, and I like the idea of helping patients, helping people, working to improve people's lives that are affected by various disease states and things like that. So that's kind of the path I took, kind of that med tech
Hmm.
medical path, possibly because I was interested in medicine earlier. But really, I focused again on movement. So, my specialty has always been these movement sensors, these accelerometers and gyroscopes. So then the question came out, well, how can we use movement to better understand disease state, disease recovery, et
Yep.
cetera? And so things like stroke, right? We know that stroke is defined as essentially a loss of movement, and there's a reduction in movement, et cetera. And so some of the things that we want to focus on with stroke rehabilitation is regaining that movement and regaining what the patients can do. And so what we wanted to do, some of the work I've been doing in some of the startups I worked for was quantifying exactly what the movement abnormality is. So asking a patient to say, lift one side of their arm up, because stroke is usually unilateral, it only happens on one side, versus the other side, and actually
Hmm.
quantifying to say, okay, well, they've lost 20 degrees of shoulder flexion, they've lost this range of motion, et cetera. And that kind of information can help to guide their future rehabilitation. Also, it's seeing what types of exercises can actually improve that. One of the hardest things is figuring out, for each individual patient, what exercise should we be focusing on for them? What should they be assigned? What do we need to work on? And so, by quantifying those movements and quantifying exactly where those patients were in space, we could help provide better targeted therapy to that patient. So those exercises that are coming that are just to you, that are focused on your specific movement abnormalities, and are hopefully going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. So if you've ever done physical therapy, nobody really loves doing it. It's not the favorite thing. So if we can get a targeted set of a short series of exercises that only take 10 to 15 minutes, but are really focused exactly on what's going to help you and your recover from your injury, hopefully you'll do them and you'll be more likely to recover faster and you'll get back to that strength faster. So that was kind of the idea of doing very targeted therapy with stroke rehabilitation. For things like Huntington's disease is an extremely debilitating degenerative disorder,
Right.
characterized by these choreiform movements, which are sort of uncontrollable dance-like movements in their very extreme state. But they start off sort of small movements. And so one of the things we know patients, because of the genetics of Huntington's disease, we know which patients are much more likely to get Huntington's disease than others because it is a genetic disorder and you do inherit it. So we know patients that are at risk. So the question is, can you identify the earliest stages of that movement just from using simple sensors like a smartwatch or things like that to try and see, okay, the disease is progressing, like we're starting to see progression. Can we do more interventions, right? Can we say, okay, something is happening with this patient. We want to intervene now. We want to get them in for targeted therapy because we do know that therapy for Huntington's disease can help slow the progression of it. So if we can identify it at an earlier state, we can slow the progression at an earlier state and hopefully allow people to have a much better quality of life for longer by having early intervention. As well as with chorea, just trying to identify how it happens, when it happens, identifying those movements. All that information can help change the course of treatment for the patients and help get that intervention early and get them the help that they need as soon as possible, particularly with movement disorders that are noticeable. Like a lot of the issue with things like Huntington's is there is a lot of social stigma around unanticipated movements, et cetera. And so can we get them that treatment to sort of make sure people are still going out, having a good quality of life, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting because I come out of the pharmaceutical industry. I profile a lot of pharmaceutical industry guests on the show, and it's just thinking back the last 30 years how our industry has really transitioned a lot, and I enjoy seeing sort of these convergent themes coming in terms of the digitalization and the AI, and that we're no longer an industry that's about pills and injections. There's a lot more going on. You're, in this Data Sciences Institute at Takeda, one of the world's largest pharma companies, and reading about this unit, it's a lot more than some, digital tech folks. You got pharmacologists, epidemiologists, medical folks, outcomes research, and it sort of says on the website, you're looking at, bringing this digital culture to all the products, to all the patients that you serve. And again, I think this is kind of just like the iPhone was coming into play during your PhD. This is kind of a really ideal time for someone with your specialty coming into the pharma industry. Talk a little bit about, I guess, your arrival at Takeda and a little bit about what the Data Science Institute is all about.
Yeah, sure. So the Data Sciences Institute at Takeda is a functional unit within Takeda. And so as a functional unit, we support all the different therapeutic areas across the entire company. So we don't specifically focus in neurology or oncology or GI. We'll support any program anywhere. And the goal of the Data Science Institute is better health through data insights. The CEO of Takeda, Christoph Weber, has focused so much on becoming a digital biopharma company because we do make drugs, but we also generate huge amounts of data. Particularly, sometimes pharma companies are the repositories of the largest data sets on the disease states that they're studying, especially for rare diseases. If you want to know about a rare disease, the unit or the conglomerate that's going to have the most amount of data on those patients is probably the pharma companies that are studying them to try and make targeted therapies for them. And our goal at Data Science Institute is to use that data, to use the data in digital, to get new medicines to patients faster, to take all this data that we're acquiring and use it as a way to say, why are these drugs working? Why aren't these drugs working? How can we better target the next round of drugs to target these patients to help them out? And so I think that's a very forward-facing view of what a pharma company is. It's a very forward looking to say, hey, we don't just make medicines. We also make data. And this data can be incredibly useful in understanding the patients and making the medicines better, right? This feedback loop of saying, okay, we tried one medicine, it didn't work for this reason, so let's feed back into the next one and use this data. And so that's really where the Data Sciences Institute comes in. As you said, it includes like statisticians, it includes epidemiologists, it includes back-end architecture working to bring in that data in a cleaner way. And again, we're about 1,000 people strong, so we are a fairly large group within Takeda, and it's really grown in leaps and bounds since I started. I think I started, we were just under 300 people within the DSI, and now we're over 1,000. So it's definitely exploded in the last few years, and I think that's to meet the needs of the company as we transition into this digital biopharmaceutical company and really move into the new world, and using tools like AI, using tools, like new drug discovery, using, building out our back-end infrastructure, becoming much more of a digital company than just a traditional pharma. And again, that's all to serve the patients, right? It's all to say, how can we use this data to advance our agility, our innovation, to really increase our ability to develop medicines, both to identify novel candidates, figure out which ones aren't going to work faster, right? And get rid of candidates that aren't going to work sooner before we go through the development process, and really only advance the ones that are the best bets and that are showing to be the most effective for patients. So I think, when I started in pharma about 7 or 8 years ago, and that was just about the time where pharma was saying, hey, we can collect more data on these patients by using digital tools, but we don't exactly know what to do with this data, because it was new, right? Like, we were just sending out digital tools on patients, we're just sending patients home with wearable devices or measuring them in the clinic with wearable devices. And suddenly huge amounts of this data was coming in, but there was nobody really in the pharma sphere who was able to kind of quantify that data and really crunch it down. Because, taking a raw data stream, right? Taking a raw accelerometer stream and turning it into an actual actionable health insight is not an obvious process. And that's something that I had been doing in my career. I've been taking these raw sensors and turning them into actionable insights, turning them into health metrics. The easiest example is taking a raw accelerometer signal and turning into steps per day, or turning it into amount of time you've slept in the evening. You're taking a signal and turning it into an actual health metric. And then the question is, well, how do I use this health metric? And so for pharma companies, we had very specific health metrics we were interested in. So one of the first programs I worked on at Biogen was in Parkinson's disease. And Parkinson's disease is, a very well-known disorder quantified by abnormal movement. We know that Parkinson's disease patients, one of the ways that many of the symptoms of PD result in abnormal movement. So some common abnormal movement is freezing of gait. So there's this stutter step of gait. This is in we usually, when we walk, we have a very consistent flow of our steps, a very non-variable, very metronomic-like steps. That doesn't happen in Parkinson's disease. There's a stuttering, there's a stopping, there's this freezing that is, not only it makes it harder to walk, it's very dangerous because it increases the risk of falling, and falling can be devastating to anyone, but particularly a patient with Parkinson's disease. There's also this symptom of bradykinesia, which is sort of this like halting movement that'll happen with the arms, and it also happens with the legs. That again causes that stuttering. But this bradykinesia movement, where there's this sudden freezing and stopping and movement of the body, as well as tremors. Tremors is another common movement from Parkinson's disease. And so all these things are symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And we can ask patients to report on them, to say, how bad is your bradykinesia today? How often is it happening? How detrimental is, et cetera. Or we can use a wearable device to measure it. We can use a wearable system. You can use, a smartwatch. You can use sensors on your hands. You can use sensors on your body to measure these abnormal movements, to try and quantify, is the disease progressing? How much is the disease progressing? How fast is it going? Is it going from one limb to the other? Is it going from unilateral to bilateral? Also, is a treatment stopping it, right? Is a treatment either halting the progression or actually improving it? Is there a way to tell, is this treatment actually working? Are we improving the patient's lives? Are we improving their movement? Are we improving the way are their tremors going down? That kind of thing. And so that was really where the interest came from, is that, hey, we know these sensors can measure the movement. Hey, we know that we have these symptoms and we really want to measure these symptoms. But once this data comes in, what do we do with it? How do we use it? How do we create these health insights? How do we measure the amounts of bradykinesia episodes? How do we measure the freezing of gait? How do we measure tremors? What do we actually do to quantify this raw data stream, this very large raw data stream, into actionable health insights that then the clinical program can make a decision on? Because that's really the name of the game in a pharmaceutical trial, is
Right.
you want to get the best data to the clinical team so that they can make a clinical decision about what is in the best interest of the patients in terms of how this pharmaceutical drug is working. Like, you need to get them the data so they can look at it and make a clinical decision, because that's their goal. Their goal is to say, hey, we need to make the best decision for our patients. We need the best data here, and we need as much data as we can to make a good decision, because we want to make the right decision for patients. We only want to bring drugs forward that are working, and we want to stop drugs from development that are not working. And so that's really where this comes in. This is a whole new data stream that these clinicians have never had before, that can help tell them how these patients are feeling, functioning, and surviving, which is the FDA criteria for drug development. And so when you look at how the patient feels, functions, or survives, we can give you a lot of information, particularly in the home environment, of how these patients are sleeping, how they're walking around at home, if they're having these types of, for Parkinson's disease patients are having these types of symptoms, there's these types of episodes at home. We can help to quantify that and bring that information back to the clinicians to say, hey, this is what you're not seeing. This is what's happening in between clinic visits. Patients' sleep is improving. Patients are reporting, 20% less tremors. Oh my goodness, that's wonderful. That's amazing. This drug is working. Or there really is no change. It doesn't seem that, it seems like progression is still going. I don't think this molecule is really going to be working. And that's where pharma companies have really been leveraging this type of new technology and these types of this new information, is to bring in information we've never had before, to give to the clinical team to help them make a better decision about the patients in their clinical programs.
And you just mentioned the FDA there, and clearly well, I'm not in it anymore, but extremely highly regulated field. I had Dr. Bumpus on from FDA last year, talking about how their job in keeping up the speed with all these new things that are not the traditional pills or injections. At the same point, you have to convince organizations like the FDA that ultimately what this ultimately looks like in the clinical setting, what the proper standardization of all this new digital tech is. There's a very interesting paper that you were involved in back in 2020. It was entitled Pre-Competitive Census Building to Facilitate the Use of Digital Health Technologies to Support Parkinson's Disease Drug Development Regulatory Science, where you got together with pretty much every other pharma company in the world and, sort of hashed out, this is how we do this regulatory thing with the digital health. Let's talk a little bit about this, because this pre-competitive concept, we've actually heard a little bit about it on the show in the past, that when we come to some of these things that have not been, gone through the gauntlet yet at FDA, say a few words about this paper, if you would.
Yeah, so I think taking a step back and looking at the FDA, the FDA has a hard job. They have a very, very hard job, right? They are trying to figure out whether or not the drug before them and the data package before them shows that this drug is actually bringing benefit to the patients and how they feel, function, or survive. And it's never a slam dunk, like, it's never, oh, this is perfect, it's great, it's, curing the disease, everything's great. That their job would be easy, right? Their job is hard. There's always conflicting information. There's always, well, it improved cognition this much, but it didn't really improve movement this much, and it did this, you know what I mean? And they're trying to make a big decision around it, because they can't walk it back, right? Once the drug is approved, it goes forward, and once it's not approved, it's done. Like, no one's developing on it anymore, So it's a very, very hard line that they have to take. And so the FDA tends to be conservative, right? They tend to err on the side of, hey, we want to make sure something is truly showing benefit to how a patient feels, functions, or survives before we go forward with that. And so, because of them being conservative, coming in with these new tools, giving them data they've never seen before, right? I mean, that's tricky, right? Like, you come in and you say, hey, this drug helps a patient sleep better, and this is all the data we've shown. They can't compare that to a drug that didn't measure the sleep, right? Like, they don't have a comparison. They say, okay, well, is it better than the drug we already approved? If that drug never measured those at-home measurements, now they have a whole new class of data that they have to make a decision on that they don't have precedent for. And so it's hard. It's a hard decision to make. And so one of the things that we found is the sort of the best way to approach them is through these pre-competitive consortiums. Because I think that the FDA has taken a strong and smart stance in saying, hey, if we can get all these competitor companies together, right? If all these pharma companies come together who are competing on their drugs and trying to bring to market drugs faster, and they all agree that this aspect is important or this concept is important, then it probably is important because they don't usually agree on much and they don't usually work together on much. So the FDA has really been pushing forward these pre-competitive consortia because they feel that this is the best way to get a consensus in the field from KOLs, from pharma companies, from payers, et cetera, on what is important in that area of study. And that's where so the FDA has been very much proposing these things. And so this paper that we wrote in 2020, and again, I was one of, I think, 40 co-authors on this. So it was definitely a very large group effort. It certainly wasn't just, I played a very small role in it. And there were many, many people who worked very hard on all this, was really trying to give the lay of the land of what the different consortium were in digital health specifically for Parkinson's disease and what each one of those groups was working on and what they were trying to advance forward. Because at the time, there was no digital endpoint approved for Parkinson's disease. And that is still the case today. There still has not been a digital endpoint approved for Parkinson's disease for a drug development trial, probably because the industry still hasn't consolidated on one or two. There's still 20 to 30 different metrics that people are pushing out there to say these are important, and they all might be important, but the FDA can't have 20 to 30 different metrics to say this is how we're going to show superiority in our trials. They need to have one or two to show. And because the industry has not yet consolidated around those one or two in digital health, we're not there yet. And I have hopes looking towards the future, like looking forward, that we will be able to consolidate around a few that have the strongest evidence, but we're still not quite there yet. And so because we aren't, the FDA hasn't come there yet. So we as a field need to come together more to select the best metrics to really say these are the ones that are going to show the best progression. And so that's what this paper was kind of focused on back in 2020, is bringing together a whole bunch of different groups, detailing all the different groups that are working on these types of initiatives. So groups like the Digital Medicine Society, which is a nonprofit group on focusing on Parkinson's, not just Parkinson's disease, many different digital health aspects. The PPMI, Parkinson's Progression Markers Initiative, again, focusing on how can we progress not just digital markers of Parkinson's, but all markers in Parkinson's disease. Groups like the Michael J. Fox Foundation. The Michael J. Fox Foundation is a massive nonprofit that has funded huge amounts of research into Parkinson's disease. And they have been focused, they had a big arm on digital to say, hey, we really need to get digital here. The IMI initiatives like Mobilize D, which I've also been a part of, which is focused partially on understanding mobility outcomes and successful mobility outcomes for many different diseases, one of which in Parkinson's disease. And also the big one here was the CPAth Institute, the Critical Path Parkinson's Institute. And so this is a nonprofit that was focused on, again, really looking at different digital markers of Parkinson's disease, and outside of their development trial, looking at the natural history of Parkinson's disease patients through a specific program called Watch PD. And Watch PD this is one of the major initiatives that was funded out of the CPAth Institute, and Biogen and Takeda were a part of it. So I actually worked on the project both at Biogen and in Takeda, which is very interesting to see it from both sides. But then it expanded much more outside of the two companies. Those are the two that started it, but then many more companies came in. That was to look at the natural progression of Parkinson's disease over a 2-year period using specifically digital health tools, both in the clinic and at home. So there's a very heavy at-home monitoring component. And the goal of all these natural history studies is to really see which feature, which digital measurement is going to be the one that tracks progression the best. So again, looking to find, to winnow this down with digital measures, you can have hundreds of features that you create, these types of features, like a concept, like number of tremors per hour, or amount of bradykinesia during the day, or number of freezing of gait episodes. You can have hundreds of these. But again, for the field, we really need to narrow down to one or two that really track the progressions in Parkinson's disease, that we can say, hey, this is the best digital marker that will track Parkinson's disease. And if we go to the FDA, we suggest you use this as a digital endpoint to say, okay, this is an endpoint that we can say in this, if you do a clinical trial in Parkinson's disease and you use this endpoint, we will accept it. And we will say that, yes, if you show that your drug improves this endpoint by X%, then we will approve the drug. And that's really where we need to go as a field, is trying to winnow down to say, what are the 1 to 2 metrics in digital health that measure Parkinson's disease that are most critical to the disease and most critical to the patients. Again, it's not just does it measure, it has to be important to the patients. Again, how they feel, functions, or survive. And that's where we really need to go to the FDA and say, hey, we think this should be your endpoint. It should be, it's not going to be steps per day, but that's an example of one. It could be steps per day, or it could be number of freezing episodes, or it could be gait variability, like the how people move and how they walk, and looking at that stutter stepping, these different things. This is the measure we think you should focus on. And so that's really where this paper was focusing on, was like highlighting all the different areas, all the different initiatives that were happening at the time for this, and also talking about the importance of them and what the digital health metrics they were working on and what the ones they were suggesting were the best, to try and get some consensus in the field. Though I do have to say, in 2024, we're still not there yet with Parkinson's disease. It's a big one. It's a very critical disease, and so there's a lot of eyes on it. And we're still working, but I think especially with recent changes within the FDA, they're going to be a lot more open to digital health going forward from this point.
Yeah, I think it fits nicely. As you were pointing out earlier about, and again, this theme throughout your career about collaborative nature of the stuff that you're involved in. And I mean, this is, the ultimate collaboration in the sense that you don't normally hear of, all the four pharmaceutical companies working together on something as critical as this. But it's important that for each of them that you do. Let's just put it that
and
way.
I will say that as a pharma, and this goes, I mean, I know most of the people in pharma from digital health, at least certainly in the US,
Right.
we compete on drugs, we collaborate on endpoints.
Yes.
Takeda's not going to sell an endpoint.
Right.
Pfizer's not going to sell an endpoint. J&J isn't going to sell an endpoint. But if we all use the same endpoint, then we can actually show whether or not our drugs are better than the others. And so that's one of the real, like, the digital health community in pharma is actually very collaborative and very open, and really trying to push these consortiums, looking at these different endpoints, making them open source, not making them proprietary, because a rising tide lifts all boats. It's only if we all agree on this and we all say, hey, this is the endpoint, this is what we think, this is all our evidence showing the endpoint, that we're really going to go forward, and we're really going to advance the field forward. And so I think that's one of the things that I like about being in pharma for digital health, is that we're never really competing, we're always working together, and I can pretty much call everybody within the group and say, hey, I got this really neat thing, can I talk to you about it? And it's a very nice environment.
Yeah, it's outstanding. Let's talk a little bit about a couple of the other programs that you're working on. Top line, the obviously Parkinson's is a big one, but you're also have been involved in this radar AD for Alzheimer's disease, on looking at how these mobile and digital technologies can improve our Alzheimer's assessment. And clearly, this is an area that major unmet medical need, a lot of discussion that we've had on this show in terms of having earlier, the early signs of the disease, as well as sort of, the later progression. You're also involved in something really cool called COVID Red, which I guess exemplifies the other end of the spectrum here. These are not, clearly these tools of application for the long-term degenerative, but, this is sort of the other end of that spectrum. And I'd love for you to just give us the top line, if you could, on some of these projects. That'd be great.
Sure. So a lot of these, Radar AD, COVID Red, and then another one that I'm involved in is called Mobilize D. These are all IMI initiatives, or these are all coming out of Europe. The IMI, I'm gonna not pronounce it well because it's in French, and my French is not so strong. But it's sort of almost the equivalent of the NIH for Europe, and it's a very large granting agency that is focused on bringing together many European countries all together to work collectively on a topic of health. And it's because each European country is much smaller than the US, it really benefits all of Europe to band together and work together collectively on these IMI initiatives, because they're able to do much larger projects if they're all working together as a unit rather than each individual company. So the two that I've been most involved with is COVID Red and
Yep.
Mobilize D. And COVID Red was a very short-term one that was, again, coming out of the pandemic, that was really focused on, can we use digital health technology to identify a COVID infection earlier? Can we identify it, earlier than the patients start to feel symptoms? Because, again, very early on in the pandemic, it was very important to try and get people treatment as soon as they could to prevent the progression of COVID. And so the goal of that was a very tight, it was a very short 2-year program that was looking at a wrist-worn device that had previously been used for women's health. Actually, it was specifically looking for fertility and ovulation, and looking to track those changes to see when the best time to conceive a child would be, and repurposing all that information, because the biggest thing with fertility and ovulation is temperature, and the biggest indicator of COVID was temperature. So it was really saying, okay, well, can we take this device that had been developed for something else but had the right sensing modalities on it, and can we turn around an algorithm that would use those same sensing modalities and identify a COVID infection, before the patient even knew it was happening, so that we could say, hey, we think you're about to come down with COVID. You need to start isolating. You need to, take a test. You need to get to the doctor, et cetera. And so that was a very short and very focused program on COVID, and we were able to show, based on data that came out of Europe, that we were able to identify with the I think it was the version 3 algorithm, a COVID infection 2 days before patients started reporting symptoms, because we started to see changes in heart rate, we started to see changes in temperature before the patient even realized that they were coming down with COVID. And so the idea was that with this algorithm, we would be able to flag at 2 days, hey, we think you're about to get COVID, you need to go in for extra testing. Obviously, now the pandemic has changed a little bit, so the idea is to retrain the algorithm using the same metrics to look for any respiratory infection. Because now that COVID is not quite as much of a concern compared to other respiratory diseases, we still do have a concern for respiratory diseases, right? And so now the goal is to say, okay, take all this great work we did to identify COVID, retrain the algorithm using other respiratory illnesses and using those infection rates for them. So that can we identify if you're going to come down with a respiratory infection such as flu, which is still very devastating, a couple days before, and hopefully get you, things like Tamiflu, and those treatments only work if you take them before you actually have full-blown symptoms. So if we can identify, hey, you're about to come down with flu, you should start taking a drug like Tamiflu, we can hopefully mitigate the course of the disease. So that's one of the ones. I talked a little bit about Mobilize D before, but this is a very large consortium within Europe that is just about ending. So it's a 5-year, I think like 50 million euro project across almost 100 institutes, both public and private and academic within Europe, that's focused on mobility. And so Mobilize D is all about finding out those mobility assessments and connecting them to clinical outcomes. And so this goes back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier with Parkinson's disease, is like understanding mobility being how you walk as a measure of health, and quantifying those measures of health, and then identifying which ones focus on how the patient feels, functions, and survives. And so really there was a whole big push around there was 5 patient populations for Mobilize D. That was chronic COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, Parkinson's disease, PD, that was where Takeda was mostly interested. Multiple sclerosis, or MS, was another one of the disease states. Osteoporosis and sarcopenia, so hip fracture recovery, et cetera, PFF it's also called, as well as heart issues, so congestive heart failure, or CHF. All of these diseases, what they all have in common is changes in mobility. They all result in changes in your daily active state, your movement, like either through neurological or degenerative, et cetera. And so what Mobilize D was focused on was saying, okay, we want to create a suite of algorithms that will quantify features of movement in daily life. So as you go about slow walking, quantifying your walking speed, quantifying how you're walking, quantifying, how often you're sleeping, how often you're moving, etc. And then the important thing with Mobilize was tying those outcomes to the disease states to show which ones were most important in that progression of the disease or in how the disease is moving for regulatory approval. And so that was the goal. The goal was to say, okay, we want to identify which mobility outcome metrics are most important to COPD, which ones are most important to Parkinson's disease, which ones are most important to MS, and then bring those to the regulatory body. In their case, mostly the EMA, but because that's the European Medical Agency, but also some for the FDA to say, hey, we think these mobility metrics are the most important. And it is coming to an end. So it's been 5 years now through a pandemic. That was very exciting, launching in April of 2019, and then so, the world changed less than a year later.
Yep.
But it's coming to an end, and there has been a lot of really great papers that have come out already and are coming out. And there's been a lot of great regulatory agency interactions to say, hey, we've settled on these features, right? I mean, that's really where Mobilize D was trying to go, is saying these are the features. We've proven that these are the features because we've done clinical studies to show that these are the features. Now we'd like that regulatory approval on it. So it should be an exciting next couple of years as we move through that regulatory process and we present this data package to the regulatory bodies to say, we did the research, we did everything you asked for. We think these are the metrics. We'd like you to now go forward and approve these as endpoints for these clinical trials in these specific disease states.
Ariel, I mentioned in your bio at the beginning that you did a postdoc at Technion, and there you were working on robotics, and specifically you're working on this really cool sort of rehabilitation system for that could be used in the home. In general, I think robots are cool, and, and all applications of robotics, especially for human health, are pretty neat. We chatted a little bit offline about some of the other things that may be coming down the pipeline with regard to sleep hygiene, obviously very, very hot topic nowadays. Sweat, which we talked with the sports medicine folks a little bit about, but love to get your sort of your future vision here. Looking out the next 5-10 years, what else gets you excited in terms of some of these new tools, specifically in terms of applications towards these chronic degenerative diseases, as we move them from sort of just human enhancement, let's say, to their application in disease and disease recovery. What else gets you excited as you look out the next 5-10 years?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I still have hopes for that Iron Man robotics suit, like that's
That'd be
that's
cool.
definitely having dabbled in robotics a little bit, I do. It always seems like it's 10 years out, it
Right.
keeps moving 10 years out. But I think that especially in the wearable device aspects, there's a lot of really exciting things coming down the pipe. The thing that gets me most excited is non-invasive blood pressure monitoring.
Okay.
So that is so typical blood pressure monitoring. You put on a blood pressure cuff, it squeezes your arm, it tells you your blood pressure release. Not really pleasant. No one really likes getting their arm squeezed, and it's not something that you want to do more than maybe once a day at the most. Most people don't want to do it once a year, right? But blood pressure is one of these vital signs. I mean, blood pressure is one of the classic 5 vital signs that gives you so much information about health, and changes in your blood pressure are critical to identify very early on, because blood pressure is one of those things where if it starts to go bad, either very low or very high, you can get very sick very quickly.
Yeah.
And so there is a lot of research going on into non-invasive blood pressure monitoring, or basically blood pressure monitoring that can be done without the cuff, without,
Nice.
putting anything into your body, looking at, using that blinking green light that's on the back of your smartwatch, that's called a PPG sensor, using the PPG sensor to shine light and really understand blood pressure. And this has been sort of the holy grail for a while. There's been a lot of attempts on this to try and understand it, but now some really big players are getting into this space. Apple is looking to put out non-invasive blood pressure monitoring. Samsung is looking at it. There are some big companies. There's a lot of startup companies that have algorithms out there to try and tie in that light sensor into, understanding non-invasive blood pressure. So I really think in the next couple of years, we're going to see some really good non-invasive blood pressure monitoring tech come out. And I'm very excited for that, because it's really needed. And it's really been the technology that's holding us back. The sensors haven't been powerful enough. There hasn't been enough battery. We don't really get enough sensitivity with it. There's some issues with different skin tone, et cetera, that are starting to get worked out as we get, stronger and stronger tech. There's also ones looking at, there's a new sensor I saw that's actually looking to measure micro pressures. You know how you put your hand on your pulse and you measure it, and that's how you can tell your pulse. There's a sensor looking to do that, like micro, basically with a tight bracelet, to try and measure those micro pressures. So there's a lot of new technology that's coming out around non-invasive blood pressure that I really think is going to be very novel and very exciting coming out. Sweat monitoring too. So I think that, a lot of, then that ties into a little bit also to glucose monitoring, right? Like there's been a big push recently to understand more about, glucose and how sugar changes, things like that, not just for diabetes, but also for like sports performance, et cetera, but, potentially also for diabetic and pre-diabetic conditions. So I think that sweat monitoring ties into that. So that's looking to collect sweat and run micro analytics on it, run micro arrays on it and see, what is the composition of that sweat? What is it telling us about your body? What can we measure about these microscopic changes, and really understanding different modalities of how people live and things like that. Sleep tech. Takeda has a really major program in sleep. I've been doing a lot of studying in sleep. I personally like to sleep a lot. It's definitely something that I do every day. But honestly, sleep is one of those things where we do it every day, and people don't treat it as important enough, because, poor sleep will kill you. It won't kill you today, it won't kill you tomorrow, but it will slowly, over many, many years, kill you. So you need to really think about your sleep hygiene, how you're going to sleep. I'm guilty of it, putting your phone right in front of your face right before you go to bed, like all these terrible sleep habits we all have. But really understanding sleep disturbances, particularly around sleep apnea, or like as even Parkinson's disease has a sleep interruption as one of the earliest symptoms of it. And there's all kinds of new tech that's coming out to measure sleep. There's, sound monitoring to understand, what your snore says about you, to see, okay, are we actually getting apnea? Can you identify apnea through snoring sounds? Also situations where there's these new completely passive monitoring through Wi-Fi to basically say, how are you sleeping? How are you moving? So there's a company coming out of MIT. It's called Emerald Technologies, that uses essentially disturbances in the Wi-Fi waves to measure how you're moving about, and really understand, measure your heart rate while you're sleeping, measure how you're moving during your sleeping. And actually, the Google Nest does some of that too. It's using kind of that same idea, using the disturbances in the Wi-Fi signals to understanding how you sleep without actually touching you. You don't even have to wear anything. It's all passive. And so I think we're going to see new technology like that, completely passive, using the signals that are already bouncing all around you, using that Wi-Fi, using all these signals we already have, using the sound sensor from the phone that you keep next to your bed because it's your alarm as well as your life. And using, pulling all that technology together to really understand what's happening when you're asleep, and you can't tell us about it. You can't tell us how you're sleeping. You can just tell us, oh, I woke up feeling okay. But let's use more information. Let's combine the smartwatch measurements with the snore sounds, with the movement, with the under bed sensor that'll tell you how much the bed is moving, and really understand if any kind of disturbances in sleep, and try to identify things like apnea or, early symptoms of Parkinson's disease faster. So I think that there's still a lot to be done in sleep, and especially because it's something that is everybody does it every single night, and it's a really important metric about your health. There's a lot we can do with sleep, and there's a lot we can do with the new tech that's coming out in sleep.
Mm-hmm.
So I know everybody always likes to talk about AI, and I know AI. I've trained in AI and everything. And one of the things I want to say is, when everybody says AI, I want you to think fancy statistics, because that's what it is. AI is just fancy statistics. It's building a model using different technologies to try and mimic what's happening. So fancy statistics. But I do think there's a lot that can be done with fancy statistics, particularly, again, around mining of data sets. So one of the things that that AI is really good for is looking for anomalies, right? It's looking, you build a model and you say, this is the model, what it should like, using all this huge amounts of data I put into it. And these are the anomalies we're trying to identify, right? These are the Parkinson's disease patients, or these are the, sleep apnea patients, or et cetera. These are how they differ from the standard model. Go find more of these, And so I think that AI is really good at finding those anomalies and putting together patterns that are different that humans wouldn't necessarily put together. So the use of AI around things like looking at medical records, like pulling in lots of data through medical records and looking for anomalies to try and find patients who have undiagnosed sleep disorders, who have potentially early stage Parkinson's disease, who have potentially early stages of these diseases, to say, hey, we think you might be developing Parkinson's disease, even though you really haven't had the classic symptoms yet. Maybe go get checked by a neurologist so that we can try and intervene early, So I think there's a lot AI can do there. Also, I really like the use of AI for vocal biomarkers. So,
Okay.
I focused on movement sensors throughout most of my career, but there's a ton of other sensors out there. And voice, how somebody speaks, is actually a very sensitive marker of how their health is. Like, think about all the people you know what their voice sounds like, and if suddenly their voice sounds off, you're like, hey, are you getting a cold? I think you might be getting a cold. I think something is coming down. Or are you feeling okay? You sound a little off today. Humans do this, right? Humans do this all the time. We listen to someone and we say, you don't sound like you normally do. Something is wrong. Something
Mm-hmm.
is different. And what we can do with vocal biomarkers and AI is actually quantify that something is different, something is wrong. Like, again, we have very rich data sets of people's sounds, right? This is where you and I are talking for 45 minutes. You could create a model off of our voices to really understand who we are. You feed enough information and say, hey, this is how Ariel sounds on a normal day. This is how she
Mm-hmm.
sounds when she's healthy. Let's take a snippet. Let's feed in, 30 seconds of her talking. Has anything changed? Has there been a change here? And looking at those differences in those vocal biomarkers to say, hey, we think something has changed. You're coming down with a cold. You're coming down with flu. You're coming down with ALS, right? I mean, like, there are many disease states that
Right.
result in voice changes, ALS being the classic one, like speech patterns are indicative of certain diseases. You can use things like vocal biomarkers to identify progression of those, or to see, like, hey, is there an early detection of it? The voice is such a rich sound. With movement, there's a lot of sensors, there's a lot of information I can do with movement, but I essentially only have 6 data streams to work with from the sensor. With voice, I have hundreds of data streams. Voice is such a rich frequency. Again, think about how you say, hey, I think that person sounds down today. They're sounding depressed, or they sound happy, right? We're pulling all that information out of these vocal biomarkers with our ears. So the question is, how do you use AI or fancy statistics to build a model to identify those same aspects and to identify those changes? Mental health, right? You can potentially identify early depression using somebody's voice, and say, hey, I think they're starting to come down with a mental health disorder based on the change of their sound, based on how they sound, based on the words they say. So I think there's been a lot of work in vocal biomarkers so far, but I do think there's going to be a lot more moving forward that we can use with such a rich data set. Specifically, everybody loves ChatGPT. ChatGPT is not useful for everything, but something like vocal biomarkers is a really great use case of that, because we're looking at words, we're looking at how words get put together, we're looking at sentences, we're looking at how they're put together, how they form. Is that normal, or are we looking into possibly a depressive state or something like that? So I think with these new tools, using these new tools to do what our brains instinctively do, right, what you
Right.
instinctively do with all the people around you, trying to model that and create diagnostics off of it, is going to be a huge area moving up in the future.
It's really exciting. I personally, having had blood pressure for something like 30 years now, and knowing every time I take my blood pressure and it's up, I get angry. So then it goes up even higher. So I would love that non-invasive monitoring. But everything you're talking about here, from the vocal biomarkers to that cool Wi-Fi sleep technology and all that, it's all fitting into this. In my sort of, when you look a little even beyond the body, from the wearables, it all sort of fits nicely into this theme that has been kind of interesting for us the last couple of years, in terms of aging in place, aging in the home, the smart home, and all that. So it's neat to see your future visions and how it sort of all wraps into this concept that from everything you're talking. We profiled a smart toilet a couple of months ago, that ultimately our home becomes this ultimate sort of measurement and sensing package around us as we age, and hopefully don't get sick. So it's yeah, it's really exciting, and I seeing the future that you're envisioning here. So no, I love it. I really
Yeah,
love it.
And I think that's actually a good point you bring up. A lot of this technology is assistive technology. Like what can we do to augment your life to make it a little bit easier for you to live the life you want to do? Like a lot of times it's hard for people to go out to the grocery store if they have a movement disorder, right? If you can use a voice technology to order Instacart to your house, right? You can stay in your house longer. Like you don't have to go out and do that. If you can use these, if you can have these monitoring systems here to say, if you're looking for a loved one, especially a parent who's aging in place, you want to have more monitoring tech on them to make sure that if there's anything that arises, you can get there quickly. You can know, like there's fall sensors. I previously worked on a fall sensor just that will automatically call if it detects a fall and there's no response, right? So if you have a fall sensor for a parent at home, and should they fall, it calls maybe they can stay in their home longer, right? Maybe they don't have to go to an assisted facility. If you feel like, every time they fell, I'll get an alert and I can be there in 5 minutes,
Yep.
like that helps them stay in the place that they're comfortable in, that they want to be in, without the additional medicalization, right? So use of this type of assistive technology to really take away some of the challenges, as well as monitor for health changes, can really help people feel secure in staying at home, as well as their loved ones feel secure that even though they are at home, they're getting the type of monitoring you could get in a hospital setting. They're getting the type of, you're monitoring your blood pressure to see, are their blood pressure. You're monitoring medication intake, right? And medication adherence is huge. You can see with smart pill packs and everything, did somebody actually open their medicine and take it? Did they take it at the right time? Did they take all of it? These kinds of things. If you can do that from afar with a notification on your phone, that's much better than having somebody have to move into a facility where somebody has to monitor them every day. So I think that there's a huge amount of tech that we can do to help just with understanding people's lives, as well as identifying and actioning on any problems that occur quickly as possible, because that's really where the worry is. If there's a problem, you want to be able, as a caregiver, to action on it, to say, hey, you didn't take your blood pressure pills today, Dad, and your blood pressure is 10 points up. Like you can see that on your phone if you've got a non-invasive blood pressure smartwatch on, and say, hey, call Dad, got to take your pills. Like that's much easier than having him live there, things like that. Like that's a way for you to do that kind of monitoring and feel secure, both as the patient and as the caregiver.
Ariel, what's coming up for you if for 2024? Clearly, hopefully, following this episode, a lot more people are going to be following you and watching you. Conferences that you're going to be participating in, discussion panels, other public-facing stuff where we could follow you, possibly run into you and meet you. Anything else that you want to mention while we have you today, please?
I haven't quite decided my conference schedule for this upcoming year, but I always think DIA is a great conference. So that's a good one to go to. So I like that. I also like I come from an engineering background, even though I haven't been as hands-on engineering recently, but I always like EMBL as well. That's the Engineering, Medicine, and Biology Society's meeting. They always have some really exciting new tech there to see what's always so that always I feel like is like 2 to 3 years out of what's new. Like this is like cutting edge things to happen at that conference, to see what the new tech is. But what I see coming up is the big consumer companies getting into the health tech environment. Like Apple really has been pushing health tech for a while, and I've been excited to see what they have. And it's, rumors are they're coming out with either a sleep apnea monitor or some more very health tech focused things. So I think you'll see a lot more health tech coming into the devices you already have on your device. Smart rings are having a time too. There's been a smart ring Aura that's been around for a while. And I think does really great work and has shown a lot of really great new, especially with sleep and women's health. But now they're getting more competition. There's a lot more smart rings coming out, and that brings a lot of the functionality of a watch into a ring on your hand, which is again, making it smaller, making it easier, making it less invasive, so people will wear it and get more information about it. So I think that's for me, I'm excited about the upcoming tech, as well as, again, some of the changes in the FDA. The FDA has recently announced that they're forming a brand new advisory committee specifically focused on digital health, which is huge because the FDA does not form these formal advisory committees very often. This is not a common thing that happens. So this brand new FDA Digital Health Advisory Committee should help to guide the use of digital health with the FDA. And so I'm expecting that with with that, they'll have a body of people who can directly give them advice on how to promote the use of digital health within the FDA. So I think that's going to be a huge area coming forward. So we'll see. Should be an exciting year. I mean, I say that every year, and it always is.
Absolutely. No, most definitely. All right, one last thing as we wrap, I just have to ask because you brought it up at the beginning, and I have 3 kids, and I don't know, it's somewhere. I mean, I would say close to 6 figures of Legos have flowed through my home over the past, and I just have to ask because I'd like to know just for myself, maybe the audience is interested. Did you find more often than not that your situation when you got to step 97, which was the final step, you had leftover pieces, or you got to step 96 and you realized you missed step 37 and you had to go back and do all that stuff again? What was the more common scenario for you?
So when I was a kid, I definitely would miss steps and then go back and do them because I couldn't handle having
It's the
leftover
worst.
parts,
I hate that.
like I know it's the worst because you're like, where did this go? I know it's here somewhere. I know it fit. It wasn't just here but now that I'm doing Legos with my own kids, I'm starting to loosen up on that
Nice.
because I have to say, even though I in my head want to go back and do it, I also try and be the good mom, be like, you know what, this is how you want to do it. You can do it your way. I'm not gonna make you do it my way. I might sneak in like 2 hours later when you're not looking and shove the piece in there to where it belongs, but I'm not going to do that in front of you. So,
Nice. Nice. I just throw out those extra people. I put them in a little bin somewhere, pretend
yeah.
they don't exist.
You know
No,
what? I did accept that we have a 5-pound bucket of undifferentiated Legos, as I like to call them, so that
why
we
are
can
they
just
there?
build.
Exactly.
I was inspired by the Lego movie with the master builders, and they talked
Yep.
about the master builders just being freeform. And I was like, oh yeah, we should do more
Yep.
master building. So we have sets, and then we also have master builders. Great movie, by the way. Great
Yep.
movie, Lego movie. Love
Yep.
love that one.
Absolutely.
And it's still something that we do love here. We've been to Legoland. We've done a lot with Legos. I have to say, as a toy, it engages both adults and children alike. And
That
I
it
do love
does.
building Legos with my kids.
That it does. Well, no, it's been great spending time with you, Harry. I mean, I so enjoyed listening to your arc, of this amazing journey you've been on. I'm going to continue to follow you and root you and your team on as you build these
Thank you.
novel programs and technologies for patients. Again, for everybody that is going to be listening to this episode of our show across the various podcast networks or who will be watching on our YouTube channel. Again, you've been spending time with Dr. Ariel Dowling, Senior Director and Head of Sensing and Measurement within the Data Sciences Institute at Takeda Pharmaceuticals. Ariel, I really want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to talk to us for a little while, to educate us on these themes. Obviously, thank you for what you do for patients. And as we like to say on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow for everybody via what you do. Really a great story.
Thanks. Yeah, it's been wonderful. And I always like to say this to everyone. I didn't have a master plan, right? It sounds good in retrospect, but while I was going through it, there was never a master plan. I always did what I thought felt like the most interesting, exciting, innovative, what got me excited in the morning. So, when I had a career decision to make, was I going to go into engineering or was I going to go into medicine? Was I going to go to this grad school or that grad school? Was I going to take this job or that job? I always said, what am I excited about? What gets me up in the morning? What makes
Mhm.
me interested in that? And that's the decision I made. And so, I can't, sometimes it was the right decision, sometimes it wasn't, but it always made me feel energized, and I wanted to wake up each morning excited about what was coming up. So that's the best advice I can give is do what excites you, like take the path that you are passionate about. And you don't know where it might lead. Some will be dead ends, not everything works out, but at least you'll be excited about it. And that's about the best we can do.
Awesome, awesome message. Really, really great. Great having you and great seeing you.
Yep, great speaking with you as well. Thanks.